So with all that in
Yes.
mind then, let's do Electoral College.
Okay.
101, where did the idea of the Electoral College first come from?
Well, the delegates to the Constitutional Convention spent the whole summer going back and forth. Should we have a national popular vote, just like people want now? Should we do something else? They had crazy ideas. Maybe we'll have 3 presidents. Maybe we'll have, they talk about legislative selection. That was one of the main ideas on the table. Maybe we'll have Congress select the president. They talked about governors selecting the president. They had a whole bunch of ideas. But the 2 ideas that were there at the end, the primary ones, were national popular vote and Congress picks the president. Nobody knows exactly what happened because there was a committee for unfinished business and they went behind closed doors. And there was
So things haven't changed that much.
right. And so there was one report that James Madison took a pen and paper and sketched out the idea. They came back and presented to the whole convention. The convention was surprised that they had deviated from national popular vote. But this is what they had decided on. And it solve the concerns of the big versus small states that have been going back and forth the whole summer. The big states, by and large, were more comfortable with national popular vote idea. The small states were really uncomfortable. They thought they would be tyrannized. And there's a great quote from a Delaware delegate, and he says, "I do not trust you, gentlemen. If you have the power," he says gentlemen, which I think is funny. "I do not trust you." He's like underlined in italics, you know. Right. Gentlemen, if you have the power, the abuse of it could not be checked, and you would exercise it to our destruction. And that's what the small states felt, that we will be destroyed if you have this kind of a system in place. And I think it's important to note, by the way, that the divide here was not slave versus not slave. It was small versus large. And there were some large states that had, you know, more slaves than not, and vice versa. And the same thing with the small states. Some had slaves, some didn't. It was not a slave versus not slave divide. It was a small versus large.
8 of the first 9 presidents we've ever had were plantation owners from Virginia, which, at the time, was the nation's largest state. I say this to contextualize this argument that Tara Ross is peddling, that the Electoral College was in fact not about slavery, but was about protecting small states from big states. Tara is supposedly a historian, but how qualified a PragerU historian could be is up for a fair amount of debate. I'm not interested in declaring what type of election system is the correct one, only in slicing through the bullshit peddled on Rubin's show. Most of the arguments for the Electoral College are easy enough to cut through without the history dive. The argument that the Electoral College is to protect small states from big states is rebutted by pointing out that that is the role of the Senate. The argument that it is about giving rural voters a voice is rebutted by pointing out that rural voters have their votes count for just as much as urban voters in any given state. The real arguments against the Electoral College is that it's an affront to political equality, since the vote of one person counts for more or less than another person based entirely on geography. Also, the fact that states get votes instead of individuals means the election is really only decided by a small handful of states, which begs the question, why have elections at all? Just let Ohio and Florida decide. Another argument is that it deprives American citizens of the rights to vote should they live in territories. Over 3 million Americans live in Puerto Rico, and they cannot vote because of the Electoral College. The Electoral College already stands on pretty shaky ground. Specifically, though, Tara stated that the Electoral College was about protecting small states from big states and not about preserving slavery. That is a lie. That is a lie because Tara is a historian who should know better and must know better, and the only reason she could plausibly think to say this is because she is serving a political end and the truth cuts against her. She states that the compromise was hashed out in a back room with nobody understanding why the popular vote was scrapped and the electoral process added. We do know this. James Madison transcribed the debate process at the federal conventions, saved and dated Thursday, July 19th, 1787. During this session, the election process for the president was decided, and as was pointed out, the debate was about making the office substantially independent from the legislative branch. Quoting from the documented arguments, "If it be a fundamental principle of free government that the legislative, executive, and judiciary powers should be separately exercised, it is equally so that they be independently exercised. There is the same and perhaps greater reason why the executive should be independent of the legislator than why the judiciary should. A coalition of the two former powers would be more immediately and certainly dangerous to public liberty. It is essential, then, that the appointment of the executive should either be drawn from some source, or held by some tenure, that would give him a free agency with regard to the legislature. This could not be if he was appointable from time to time by the legislature. It was not clear that an appointment in the first instance, even with the eligibility afterwards, would not establish an improper connection between the two departments. Certain, it was that the appointment would be attended with intrigues and contentions that ought not be unnecessarily admitted. He was disposed for these reasons to refer to the appointment to some other source. The people at large was in his opinion the fittest in itself. It would be as likely as any that could be devised to produce an executive magistrate of distinguished character. The people, generally, could only know and vote for some citizen whose merits had rendered him an object of general attention and esteem. There was one difficulty, however, of a serious nature, attending an immediate choice by the people. The right of suffrage was more diffusive in the northern than the southern states, and the latter could have no influence in the election on the score of Negroes. The substitution of electors obviated this difficulty, and seemed on the whole to be liable to the fewest objections. That is the Electoral College, and how it was created. It was done so to avoid having a president appointed by Congress and intended to protect the interests of slavery. The argument that the framers were no big believer in democracy is plainly untrue and evidenced everywhere else by our institutions, where individuals were free to vote for their governors, congressmen, and any other office which was popularly elected. Also, as was just demonstrated, quite a few of the Founding Fathers were indeed fans of the popular vote system but could not get it established. The reason that was the case was because of slavery. On a final note, I really wish we would stop with this bullshit and just admit that the debate is entirely about giving conservatives an electoral advantage. That is the entire reason they want to preserve the Electoral College. This was a short and sweet just to quickly get it out of the way. I apologize for the lack of substantive content. I've been pretty under the weather lately and I'm working on getting over it. I'll get back to more researched content as soon as I can. Thanks for watching.